Welcome to the Rethink Leadership podcast with me, Jeremy Blain. I interview leaders, experts and business professionals from around the world who are bringing leadership principles and know-how into the digitally driven 21st century workplace, with focus firmly on the how-to rather than the what. Each episode is in aid of a charity chosen by my guests, and since 2020, we've made donations to over 80 global and local causes. Today, I welcome Jennifer McCollum to the Rethink Leadership podcast, and what an impressive background she brings. She's an author, speaker, CEO of Linkage, where she oversees the strategic direction and global operations of the leadership development firm. She's also a board advisor, business community champion, inclusion and equity builder, and more. Jennifer has expertise in closing the gender equity gap and continues to champion women in leadership everywhere. Prior to joining Linkage during her 35-year career, Jennifer spent a decade growing businesses within Korn Ferry and Corporate Executive Board, CEB, which is now Gartner, where among other roles, she ran CEB's Leadership Academies business, which developed more than 30,000 professionals in 2,100 companies throughout 50 countries. Jennifer now has a new book out, released last year in November 2023, called In Her Own Voice, A Woman's Rise to CEO, and has been published in the Wall Street Journal, Fast Company, and more. We discuss Jennifer's journey, her book, and advice for organisations and leaders everywhere. Jennifer, thanks very much for joining me. Please introduce yourself, your current role, and perhaps those most important leadership lessons that guide you as an experienced global leader.
Jeremy, thank you for having me. And oh, what a big question. So Jennifer McCollum, the CEO of Linkage, and for 35 years, our company has been focused as a mission to change the face of leadership. So I've been privileged to lead an organization through to the acquisition by SHRM, the Society for Human Resource Management, a little over a year ago. Leadership lessons for me, and actually I'll tell you a couple really important lessons as I became a CEO. And the first was ensure that you have the team around you that can both leverage your strengths, but also complement where you might not be as strong. So quick story, when I arrived at Linkage, there were 20 years of financials that I was sorting through. There was a complex operational global system, and I knew that I needed a very strong chief operating officer to help me with the execution of a lot of legal and technology and financial details. So that was number one. And I knew I needed a strong research function. So areas that I didn't feel quite as strong in. So that's number one. And number two is engage the organization to evolve the culture that will align to what you need behaviorally to execute the strategy. And again, what I mean by that is when I became the CEO of Linkage, we knew, and I had committed to the board of directors that we were going to transform the organization from a set of capabilities we had around custom leadership development events to a much more productized organization that could scale and digitize and repeat in ways that we couldn't before. We needed completely different capabilities and completely different behaviors. And what I learned was you needed to select and develop and engage the people aligned to the culture that you needed to execute in that environment.
Yeah, they both resonate. And that's also partly, though, for leaders, it's about holding up the hand and saying, you know what, there are things I don't know. And there are things that I can best find that from others. That's a great strength for a leader to do these days, because there's such a huge scope of a leadership job in this transformational world. And at the heart of it, as you say, culture, engaging the organization culturally, it is so much more about behaviors. We need that knowledge, but it's those behaviors and what's coachable behind the skill sets that you talk about there that really can propel us forward. Would you agree with that?
I would, and I'm actually really glad you mentioned that these evolving expectations of leadership, and I would argue that the pandemic really accelerated this, and it's actually increased even more with the kind of rapid onset of generative AI in the last year or so. And that is, it is impossible for any one leader or even collective of leaders to have all of the answers. And so this evolution of transparency and honesty around what I believe to be true and what I have no idea of, and where I need help. And especially, I think one of the evolving expectations is to admit not only where I don't know, but where something is failing. And can we learn from that? And can we appreciate that? And in some cases, can we even celebrate that? And those characteristics, I would say, those authenticity, transparency, maybe a little vulnerability, those weren't characteristics that you would use to describe successful leadership pre-pandemic. But I would say, I don't know if you agree, that those are the very characteristics that are paving the way for the new leadership model.
Oh, I couldn't agree more, Jennifer. And wrapped around all of those is the ability to show courage in actually opening up around those things. And the word vulnerability that you use is really at the heart of that. It's funny, actually, just reflecting on something else that you said. One of my favorite sayings in a leadership suite these days is one CEO is not enough. Is we have to leverage the power of the many because things are changing. You talk about generative AI, but that digital transformation 2.0 is just around the corner with Web3 as well. And that's going to catch more out, So not only are we just getting on board with Gen AI, there's something right on its coattails coming. So it's it's a need, isn't it, for leaders to kind of open up a little.
Well, and also to determine what do we have the capacity and capability to do internally on our own, and where do we need to partner? And kind of this wild frontier that we are all entering. And with 3.0 digital transformation and generative AI is, the company that acquired Linkage had made a very considerable decision that, because of the pace of IT and the security requirements of it's a membership organization with hundreds of thousands of member data. We do not have the internal capability, and we need to ensure that we are bringing in the right partners so that we can really hone in on our core strengths that we will own internally, and we will outsource or partner our way into a lot of other things that we don't know or don't understand quickly enough.
It's very clear you model these values, let's call them, that you're talking about there, and many leaders need to, otherwise they are on the road to failure because the pace of change is going to catch them out for sure. So let's move on. And you have a new book out.
I do.
And yeah, congratulations. There it is in her own voice. And the title of this podcast, I couldn't even think of a better title for this podcast. It's absolutely superb. In her own voice. So tell me, Jennifer, what's it about and what were your main objectives of getting the book out there?
So thank you for that. And that the subtitle is important. It's called In Her Own Voice, A Woman's Rise to CEO. Now, why is that important? Linkage, for the better part of 25 years, has been focused on the acceleration of gender equity and inclusion in the workplace. And we have a specific strength around advancing women leaders. We've been gathering data on women leaders, both perception data and capability data. And we had a next chapter of this story to tell, again, especially coming out of the pandemic. So this book was written to support any woman at any level who aspires to advance in her career. So a woman's rise to CEO is meant to be aspirational, wherever your aspiration is to rise. But it's also meant to support any executive or organization that wants to help women rise. And so we have a really wonderful cadre of global clients and thousands of women leaders whom we have been supporting. But this was the next chapter in the story. It was, how have the unique challenges for women changed in the last several years, accelerated by the pandemic? Why are the hurdles unique to women? And critically, what is the roadmap? What is the guidance that we can offer? And In Her Own Voice is the storytelling that we do around the hurdles, how to overcome them, and our guidance to help accelerate both women leaders and organizations who are helping them.
That's really great. And I think beyond that as well, I'd really like to know how you hope that it will also inspire young girls and women just starting their careers who not only are just starting their job, but have their eyes on being a leader either in their own business or in the corporate world.
So you have raised such an important issue about uh, women. When do they start to feel the real external bias, but also how they have internalized what has happened over millennia, and especially in the last many generations of leadership? Most women, including my college age daughter, don't really see the challenges until they're in the workforce. And I love that, by the way. So I've tell many stories in the book about me entering the workforce as a young woman in my 20s. And then there's storytelling all the way through up to a few months ago when I launched the book and as a CEO. So um, the challenge for younger women is to start to get into the workforce and then realize, well, wait a minute, you know, maybe my pay is different. Maybe I'm more reticent to ask for that promotion. Maybe I'm reticent to self promote. Maybe I'm not asking for things appropriately from my network. So these are all the hurdles that women face, not uniquely to men, but the hurdles are higher for women, and it may paralyze them from taking action. So as a very young woman coming in, you start to become aware. By the time women get to to mid management up until, rising up, and this is actually the big data, the concerning data trends that we see is the precipitous fall of women leaders when they get to that manager to early director level. We are trying to solve the problem there. Equally, you can try and solve the problem from the boardroom to the CEO. And our job at Linkage is to accelerate that. So we can talk a little bit more about the detailed hurdles, but let me pause there for a moment.
Yeah, that's interesting because there's three important points that you've made here about you're opening some of these young girls, women's eyes to the realities of what it actually means being in the workplace, becoming more self-aware of what's possible and what's not for them as well, and having the confidence to do things. And as you were speaking, I wrote some notes around manufacturing, construction, and particularly IT and technology industry, where let's say we have on average globally 48% of women are in the workforce, but only 20%, 26% are represented in IT. And I guess that's part of the heart of what your book is about, but also giving confidence to young girls and women to actually start looking at these more positively, perhaps, and breaking into some of these things more confidently. Would that be fair, or are there other barriers that we need to be mindful of?
So there's two sides to this, right? So one is whether it's by industry or by level, the statistics are dire. So when you look at by level in the United States, and I think it's worse in most other countries, fewer than 30% of women are in the what we call the senior leadership ranks. So the VP plus ranks. When you look at industry, as you've said, there are industries like construction, like technology, that are even far worse. So what's the answer here? And we believe it's two-sided. One is, and first I want to make this really clear. This is not about fixing women as leaders. Women, by and large, are exceptional leaders when we look at our leadership databases, and we can talk about that separately. This is about helping women understand that their path to leadership is different. The hurdles are higher. And because of how we've internalized a lot of these biases, it prevents us from taking action. So that's one side. The other side is women can't do it alone. Organizations have to walk alongside of them and look at their own, what they need to fix. And those are things like their talent systems, their executive commitment, executive action. This is things like sponsorship, the focus on leadership development for women. And then lastly is the culture. Is this a culture that is welcoming, where women feel like they are valued, they feel like they belong? And Linkage does work on both sides. The purpose of the book is really to speak to the women primarily. And I can give you one quick example on the Uber hurdle. It's called the inner critic. And I will tell you, I did a podcast earlier this week where there was both two professors, one woman and one man. And I talked about the inner critic and that voice of judgment that women tend to have that is louder. And it can sound like I'm not worth it, or I shouldn't speak up or ask for that promotion or that raise. I'm not ready. And I told the story of uh, being asked to consider the CEO job at Linkage about 6 years ago. And the inner critic just took off in my head. I'm not ready. I need to be a number 2 first. I don't know enough about the top of the income statement and the revenue all the way down to the net income. I've only run to the gross margin line, blah, blah, blah. And it took a couple men in my network to stop me in my tracks and help me see that my inner critic was stopping me from engaging in the best job I ever had. Now, the man in that podcast said, I don't ever hear that voice. And the woman professor who was a peer said, I hear it all the time.
That's interesting to me because as you mention it, I immediately think of imposter syndrome, and that has been loud in my head. And in fact, what you talk about resonates with me in certain parts of my career. But when I talk to a lot of my allies who are female at my level, you're absolutely right that it was that voice is louder. And for me, I didn't think it could get any louder until I heard some of these experiences. And you also made another important point about, let me put it in my terminology, male allies who help you. This is not about fixing women. This is often actually about fixing the organization and fixing men and men's attitudes within this. So when you have this discussion with your customers, your clients, or the people that are responding to your book, what's the business case that you put on the let's this is largely a mix of emotional and rational kind of reasoning behind this. But just to look at the rational for a moment, what's that business case that you put on the table that says, this is a no-brainer for this organization to embrace?
Perfect. All right. I'm not going to address the imposter syndrome now, but I'm saying it because I'd love to come back to it because you made an important point. But you've shifted, so let me address both the role of men and the role of the organization related to the business case. So as we've already talked about, there are, if you look at the Fortune 500, there are only 10%, and we just hit that in 2023, 10% are women. So we only have 50, far fewer, only 5, number 5, so 1% are women of color. So that's in any which way you can look at that and say, okay, we've got an equity problem. But you're talking about the business case, which I think is even more important. And there has been study after study after study that shows gender diversity. It doesn't even have to be 50-50, but kind of approaching that 35 to 40%. Gender equity at the top, from the board level to the executive team to the first several layers of leadership, drives such better business and cultural outcomes. You can look at it at a revenue and a margin number. You can look at it at more effective decision making and better innovation. You can look at it as better engagement or better retention by any given metric. There's new studies that have come out in the last year that say women CEOs, if you look at publicly traded companies, are actually performing better. I would say that all of those arguments, it's been very well researched and very well documented for, the better part of a decade, don't appear to be working. So then you have to say, okay, let's talk about the role of men, because 70+% of our leadership is men, right? And 90% of the Fortune 500. We cannot fix this problem without men. And we do a lot of work at Linkage to help men see not only the value to the organization, but the value to them personally as they get to know and engage and support women and other underrepresented populations, how it makes them a better leader, what is in it for them at a heart level, not just a head level. Because otherwise, Jeremy, the power of the status quo is going to be the net result if we don't create a better case for the power of the change.
Yes, I agree with you there 100%. And that mix of the rational with the more emotional benefits is a really powerful story for male allyship and beyond male allyship, actually, into male advocacy, so that there is action, there are men championing this as much as actually the women growing themselves and moving into it as well.
Yeah.
And
Well, and may I interject 1 second?
yeah.
Because you used a really important word, which is allyship. So in the book, there is a section around what is the role of the organization, and then specifically, what is the role of men? And there is an entire range. So allyship, what I would say, is at the base level, what all of us can do regardless of level. And the story I often use is when I was a new executive after the acquisition. So this is only about a year ago. And one of my peers on the executive team, he was the chief knowledge officer, and I were having this great conversation, during a break of the executive team meeting. Coming out of that conversation, our CEO have called the meeting back to order. And Alex kind of blurted out what we had been talking about. It was a high level, strategic, fascinating conversation. And Johnny, our CEO, looked at Alex and said, "That is such a good point, Alex. Tell me more." And he said, "Well, actually, I'm not going to tell you more because it was Jennifer's idea and she's going to tell you more." That is a small example of allyship that made me feel much more important and welcomed and that valued as a new member of the executive team. Okay, so very quickly, it is different from coaching. So you may coach executives. Coaching is, where do you want to evolve? How can I support you in your evolution? I might have some ideas for you. Mentorship is, I've been there before. I've been there in your shoes. And you know what? I see the door you want to walk through, and I'm going to offer you my perspective on the lessons that I learned and the best practices. What we need from men in positions of power and positions of influence, that 70+% of men in our VP plus, is sponsorship. And sponsorship sounds like this: I know you, I believe in you, and I am going to pave the way for you. Do you see that door? I'm going to guide you through it. I'm going to pull you through it, and I'm going to ensure that you succeed on the other side. Because there is no woman that wants to be put in a role where where she feels like she's destined to fail.
Presumably women leaders can play that role as well, of course, in an established business, right? And that's
And actually,
allyship. So allyship, you talk about the baseline, then sort of moving into action is more advocacy, and then absolutely being along with the journey is sponsorship. Is that right?
that's right. And there's so many fabulous men that I have engaged with that say, I'm not at the top. There's really not that much I can do. I'm an individual contributor, and my perspective is, in any room where you are in the majority, you have an opportunity to make a difference. And so even my husband, who's a very senior level banker, but is an individual contributor, is now saying things to me like, I took one of my peers to lunch because I saw how I might be able to help her with my network. And so, again, those are small things that men can do. And you raised a really important point about women helping women. The reason I focus on men is because they're 70% of the leadership majority. There are a lot more of them, right? A lot more of you. But women, gone are the days of scarcity. Gone are the days where there was only one seat at the table and we were battling for that seat. And I remember those days. I mean, in the kind of 2000s to 2010s, that was the case. There are more leadership roles available now than we have talent to fill them. So this abundance mindset of lifting others as we rise is a leadership capability, an executive level capability across the spectrum of gender.
Yes, I agree. And before I go on, actually, I'd like to just take a track back, because it's a great conversation, this, and it's a conversation that should be happening in so many more organizations than it often is, from my experience. I'm sure I read over the last week, and I may be wrong because I don't have it in front of me, but I'm sure I read in corporate America there are some voices kind of kicking back against this need to be more diverse, inclusive, and equitable, which hugely surprised me, and it sits very uncomfortably with me because I pride myself in being an advocate or a sponsor in your words, without being patronizing about it, but in a very genuine intent about getting the best for our businesses and the best for our people. Did I read that right? And if that's the case, is this a mentality issue, or do some of these men just think they're better at it?
I think you are right, and I think it's more of a backlash against the function and the term DEI, the diversity, equity, and inclusion. And look, in this country, there was the rapid rise in the Black Lives Matter and the social injustice of 2020. And there was a pretty large reaction with the rise of the chief diversity officer. In fact, many people of color became chief diversity officers from elsewhere in the business. And unfortunately, over the last year, I've actually heard recently that the word DEI now stands for dead end initiative, because what happened was those functions weren't well resourced enough. They didn't necessarily have decision making authority or large teams. They were kind of an appendage on the executive team or tucked under HR. So then there became this battle of what was run through HR or L&D versus what was run through diversity. But I think most importantly, these DEI initiatives were standalone and not really integrated into the broader business strategy, the broader executive team commitment. And it just was this little, lost function. So not surprisingly, over the last year or two, especially with the economic uncertainty of 2022 to 2023, a lot of the functional resources and people were let go. And so that backlash that you're seeing, not to mention some of the Supreme Court decisions in the United States, really, pointing a light on DEI as a potential injustice, has created a lot of risk in this country. Now, your point is really important, which is it's not that those initiatives were wrong or bad or legal or not legal. It is, where does it sit? How is it embraced? How is it resourced? And moving away from just looking at diversity into how can we all integrate inclusion into our leadership expectations?
Yes, exactly right. And I'd like to go further with this as well, because you're right. There are risks there, and there are risks in almost being overly biased towards DE and I, with positive intent, but it doesn't come across that way. But then there are leaders who are just kind of a little bit more bloody minded than that, I guess. So if I were to sit you, Jennifer, in front of some of the leaders who I would call perhaps less enlightened in this way, to help them understand the cost of not embracing a more diverse, inclusive, or equitable approach, either at senior level or across their organization, what might be the key messages that you would send them?
Yeah. And this is why I'm pleased we talked about the business case. I have found that that's necessary, but insufficient. Um, we then talk about the role of men in engaging people that don't look like them, and what is the benefit to both parties. And so oftentimes the leadership majority, again, which is mostly men and mostly white men, in at least in our respective countries, they don't until they engage as a sponsor and a committed culture transformer, they don't really see the benefit. I hear men say things like, well, I have a daughter and I want her to be able to be whatever she wants to be or to rise. And while I think that's a good starting point, I don't, I want men to engage with women in the workforce so that they can start to see. And I'll give you a real example. We've done this at one of the largest digital storage organizations in the United States. And there was a lot of resistance. It was thankfully the head of DEI, the head of HR, and the CEO were committed to a sponsorship program alongside the development of women to overcome the hurdles. We paired the sponsors with the women leaders themselves. And even though there was a significant amount of resistance up front, as time went on, with the standalone sponsors engaging with each other and then the sponsors engaging with their proteges, what happened over the course of time was the sponsors started talking about their lessons, how they hadn't seen things from the perspective of the women, how their leadership could be better because of what they were learning, how they started to engage and offer stretched experiences to people they didn't even, I don't want to say see, but we're now seeing in a different light because of that relationship. So it was that slow transformation over time. And I will also say, this isn't for everyone. If there's a resistant CEO and executive team, these efforts will not work.
Yeah, that's it. And then it becomes one of those dead end initiatives, as you called it, doesn't it? Really, and it fuels that fire in some ways. Often for me, I think also, and it's a point that you wanted to go back to, which I'll come into now, is you've got kind of two inner critics going on. We've got what we've talked about here about that inner critic of girls and women coming into the workplace and how that might get louder or go lower at certain points. And in I suppose my language, I would use it's imposter syndrome, but that happens with men as well. And I often think at those people who are not treating it like they kind of don't know what they don't know about this, so they're sort of almost avoiding the topic within that. Now I know that the you wanted to come back to make a point about imposter syndrome, so maybe I can open that up before we go
Sure.
on.
So the inner critic, and I would separate it from inner critic can lead to imposter syndrome. But that inner critic is that voice in our head that is very critical, tends to be judgmental of ourselves. By the way, it can also be judgmental of others. So becoming aware of that inner critic. So for me, it was, I'm not ready to be the CEO, or I can't be the kind of mother I want to be if I have a big job. So that led to this, internalized bias of, um, CEOs are not good mothers, and that wasn't necessarily true because I had held big jobs before. What was true was I was actually afraid of becoming a CEO because it was a new experience. I had never done it before. And that led to this imposter syndrome, when I got the job of, are people going to find out that I really don't know what I'm doing, don't know what I'm talking about? Now, interestingly, so all of us have an inner critic. Many of us may have confidence or imposter syndrome problems. But again, for women, it can really paralyze us. There's a hurdle in the book. It's called recognized confidence. And it's not about trying to beat imposter syndrome out of a woman or beating confidence into a woman. And we used to talk about it that way. 10, 20 years ago, it was if we could just make them more confident. That's not possible. What we can do is ensure that we can shine a light on the excellence of women so that over time, the confidence others have in us will become internalized. So we now teach in our work, how do women appropriately shine a light on themselves through self-promotion? And again, men by and large are very good at this. Or can we surround ourselves with others who can lift us up and shine a light on us if we are not quite ready to do it ourselves?
Oh, I really like that. Shine a light on excellence in women, so ourselves and through others. And you're absolutely right. Men do that. Men do that sometimes shamelessly, and I've been in workplaces where women have done that, and they've almost been called names for it. And it's been seen more negatively than men, and it's just so unfair. It's so doing it more appropriately, as you say. What might you mean by that?
I'll give you a specific example. So one of my direct reports, our chief product officer, does this better than anyone I know. And about once a week, I have now come to expect, it might be a text, it might be an email, it might be a conversation, where she will highlight either an opportunity she sees, a problem that she overcame. Now, I knew a year ago she wanted to get better on the stage as a keynote speaker. And so we found ways, starting with lower risk and then increasingly with larger audiences and larger risk keynotes, to put her on the stage. A few months ago, she texted me and said, I just got off the stage. I got such incredible feedback. I crushed it. In fact, the organizers said that the early scoring that they were seeing in the app was one of the top ranked speakers. And she was excited, but it was really beautifully positioned of Kristen's ready. She's ready to get on a bigger stage now. Now, there's an important hurdle that women face called the hurdle of clarity. It's the second highest hurdle. Now, Kristen was clear that she wanted her aspiration to develop as a leader. One of her aspirations was to be better on the stage. When I ask women, what do you want? You look a year, look 2 years down the road. What does success look like for you in your career, professionally, developmentally? Most women will say, I don't know, I haven't thought about it. I'm far too busy. I just want the team and the company to be successful. So they're very deferential to the team, the organization, the family. I am asking, what do you want? And the reason is because we, leaders and the universe, want to help you, but you have to get clear on what you want. Men, by and large, whether they're perfectly clear or not, they will tend to go for what they want, or at least what they perceive to be what they want, before women do.
Yeah, and and I like the way that you talk about them, these hurdles there. And I think, as a reminder for those listening in, Jennifer's new book, In Her Own Voice, A Woman's Rise to CEO, is out now, and it goes into more detail into these hurdles, but also kind of like the what next and the how to moving forward. And I'm going to ask you where our listeners can get that later, Jennifer. But as we draw to a close, actually, I'm going to bring us out of this conversation, and I want to tap your brain as a really experienced leader, full stop, out there, for some insights about kind of the current landscape that we're trying to lead in at the moment. So we're in a digitally fueled workplace. We've got other transformations around the corner when we consider, as we were talking about before, generative AI or Web3. What are the biggest or the most important leadership challenges and opportunities that you feel that leaders everywhere need to be aware of now and build their capability behind?
So we've talked about a few already. Let's just recap quickly. Given this increased pace of change, and you just rattled off some of the scariest ones because they're so unknown. What do we as leaders do to both play our part and lean in to learning and experiencing and exploring, but also allowing our employees to do the same? So at SHRM, the organization who acquired Linkage, we decided as an executive team at the end of the year that we were going to purchase ChatGPT licenses for every single employee and encourage them to engage and learn and play, so that we could start to accelerate how we were leveraging it in our own business. So that's number one. We also talked a little bit about this self-awareness, admit that we actually don't have all the answers. So that transparency, vulnerability, that authenticity and that self-awareness to know, and to admit when I'm struggling, when I don't have the answers, and what I'm learning, frankly. Okay, so then here are a couple other ones that I've been thinking about. One is, how do you actually proactively engage the diversity of voices? Not the ones, like many of our politicians, who will surround themselves with people who will tell them what they want to hear. How do we intentionally curate voices and perspectives? Again, this is a business benefit of diversity. It's not only diversity of culture, race, age, ethnicity, ability, but it's also diversity of perspective. How do you do that? And then how do you tap into a network greater than what is comfortable? We all tend to tap into and reach out to people who look like us. So those are a couple. The last one I would say, and that we've been researching a lot, is how do you actually create the culture of the multi-generations in the workforce and lead in frankly a different way, because of their expectations. And if we have time, I'll give you a couple examples of that.
Go ahead, give us a couple of examples, Jennifer.
Okay. So some of the latest work we've been doing at Linkage is to really look at, what does the workforce want across generations? And we look at kind of the societal issues we face. We look at inclusion that we've been talking about. As you look more deeply into demographics, these things become even more important. So the three things that we've surfaced is one, this very difficult dialogue and balance around flexibility, where we work, how we work, when we work. And while all generations want flexibility, women, and specifically women in the millennial and Gen Z, rate flexibility as the most important thing. The second is a commitment to well-being, especially, I know all of us want this, but especially you can look at Gen Y and Z are looking at, does my organization commit to my well-being? And this is where mental health is becoming and has become front and center. And then lastly, does my manager connect and support me? And we did a study about a year ago and found that by and large, women, while they were equally articulating their desires to their manager, felt less supported and felt less commitment from their manager than the men did.
Yeah,
so
those three. Yeah, no, that's it. But that level playing field, that proactively engaging with that diversity of thinking or perspectives, as you called it as well, the cultural elements about the flex that we want, the different workforce needs, the different ways of working, being connected and supported. It's something we all want, but it's something, as you rightly point out, that some women in the workplace, have to seemingly have to work harder to get because they're not getting that as a natural extension of the leadership or the management of that organization, right? Is that am I interpreted that right?
It is, and I'll just this is a great story potentially to end on. With the flexibility that we had to have, right, in 2020 and 2021, women actually became much more ambitious. And this is, again, a research study that came out actually by McKinsey last year. And the reason women became much more ambitious is because finally we could actually see, well, I can work from home or from the office. I can work at night. I can work in the morning. I can see how I can balance the childcare, the home care, the staff care in a different way. Now, this kind of, just like we've talked about the backlash a little bit with the DEI topic, this backlash with flexibility we have seen in the last year or two with this kind of forced march back to work. It was work wherever you want. And then it was 3 days back in the office. Now it's 4 days back in the office. And it's really being driven by the top, by CEOs who believe that there's greater productivity, there's greater innovation when we bring people together face to face. I believe that can be true. It doesn't have to be true every day in a very strict schedule. And so I'm concerned about now women being forced kind of back into the office and then losing that ambition because we can't manage our first and second and third shifts between home and the office and the staff care.
Yes, point well made, and I think it's a discussion we could go deeper into. But sadly, we've come to the end of this. And thank you for sharing so openly, Jennifer. I'm sure those tuning in will want to get in touch, find out more about Linkage, and get hold of your book, In Her Own Voice: A Woman's Rise to CEO. So, how do they do all of that?
Well, please link with me on LinkedIn. I'm actually very good if you connect with me and we can engage in a conversation. It's Jennifer Shear McCollum on LinkedIn. And then please look at my book. You can buy it anywhere. The easiest is probably off of Amazon or Barnes & Noble. And In Her Own Voice, A Woman's Rise to CEO. If you want to learn more about it, you can also go to SHRM, SHRM.org/In Her Own Voice.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, for joining me. It's been a delight and such insights coming out of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thanks for tuning in to the Rethink Leadership podcast with me, Jeremy Blain. Please like, comment, and support us on your favourite platform, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can watch as well as listen to each episode.